So this is just an introduction to Belsomra. So it's a new drug that has a new mechanism of action, and it's a sleep drug. So it helps people fall asleep faster and stay asleep. And this efficacy has been demonstrated that it works right away the first night as well as with continued use. And it's been well tolerated, and we've found very few problematic residual side effects. We've used various doses in the studies that we've done. We studied a high dose of 40 milligrams because it seemed like it was the most effective, and we also studied a lower dose of 20 milligrams because it seemed like it was effective but also had fewer side effects associated with it. We didn't feel like the 10 milligram dose was very effective, so we looked at it but didn't study it, and also we didn't look at any higher doses. So when we studied it, we did 3 phase 3 trials. We did one that was a long-term trial that lasted 12 months, and then we did 2 trials that were shorter that lasted 3 months. And overall, we studied more than 2,800 patients, and we had more than 275,000 patient nights of exposure from the drug. So we studied it in lots of patients for many nights. And we had a fairly diverse population, and 46% were elderly, and we had patients from 24 countries. And you can see that the long-term safety study on the left side looked at just the high dose, so that would be the 40 milligram dose. And then the confirmatory studies, or the other 2 studies that were only 3 months, looked at both high dose and low dose. So this slide shows the effectiveness for sleep onset. So you can see that it was effective for improving sleep onset. So there are 2 different graphs with dotted lines going down. The first one is a subjective measure of sleep onset, so that's what patients reported. And anytime the little confidence interval touches the dotted line, that means, or if it crosses the dotted line, that means that it's not statistically significant. But if it stays completely on one side or the other of the line, that means it's statistically significant. So, and then on the dotted line on the right was an objective measure of sleep onset. So that was basically a sleep study that they did that kind of traced brain waves in sleep to see if patients were actually falling asleep faster. So the one on the left is a subjective measure, a patient-reported measure, and the one on the right is an objective measure of sleep study. And then on the left, you can see that they looked at it at 3 different time points. So we looked at it at night 1, and then month 1, and then month 3. And then under each of those time points are 2 different studies that we did. So you can see basically that for most of those time points, most of them were statistically significant. So we felt that we have good evidence that Belsomra improves sleep onset. And this was the results for the low dose, but we also have results for the high dose that I'm not showing just to save time, but they were similar. And this is a similar slide, but this one was looking at sleep maintenance. So this one looks at how well people stayed asleep once they fell asleep. And this was also for the low dose. And the graph in the middle, the dotted line in the middle where it says WASO, that's the objective measure. And then the one to the left and the one to the right are both subjective measures. So those were ones that were patient reported. And again, we looked at it at the same time points, night 1, month 1, and month 3. And you can see that most of those are statistically significant because they don't cross the dotted line. So we determined that Belsomra helps people stay asleep once they fall asleep. And so our conclusions for efficacy for Belsomra are that it's been demonstrated objectively and subjectively. And we looked at it for 3 months and and then we also looked at it, I didn't show the results for the full year, but like I mentioned earlier, we looked at it for an entire year, and the efficacy was sustained over the entire year. And both the high dose and the low dose were effective. And we had consistent results in the elderly and non-elderly. I didn't show those because we were trying to save time too. And then the high dose was a little bit more effective, but the low dose was also effective. And then these are now the safety. It's kind of a summary. We looked for potential for next day side effects like sleepiness, and we found that there were some residual effects, but it was not that common, and it was, for most patients, pretty mild. And we also looked at the next day performance doing driving studies, and we found that there were a few patients, but not that many, who had problems. And then we also looked at reports of driving accidents and found that overall we didn't see a real issue with that. So we also did not see any differences by age subgroup. And this graph here shows you the actual numbers for some of the side effects that we looked at. And you can see overall, if you look at the percentages, they're pretty low. So the first column is the 0 to 6 month study, and it's the placebo compared to the low dose of Belsomra. And then the next one is 0 to 12 months, and that's the placebo compared to the high dose. And you can see, for the most part, the percentages are pretty low. There are a few cases where the high dose had a little bit higher percentage. The one that probably had the highest percentage was the excessive daytime sleepiness. But overall, the percentage was still pretty low, and most people who did have excessive daytime sleepiness had a pretty mild version of it. So we concluded that the safety has been established in more than 2,800 subjects in our phase 3 trials, with many, many person nights of exposure to the drug, and it has an acceptable safety profile with a low incidence of next day side effects like sleepiness. And those that did occur were generally mild and dose related, like we saw a little bit more in the higher dose. And we didn't see any problems with abrupt cessation or risk of abuse. So overall, we conclude that suvorexant represents a new form of treatment and uses a new mechanism of action, provides a new option for patients with insomnia. It's effective for sleep onset and for sleep maintenance. It's effective in the elderly and non-elderly, and as early as the first night you take it, as well as after taking it for a year. It was generally safe and well tolerated, and it has a pretty good clinical profile with regard to patients with insomnia.
I'm Dr. Laura Gottschalk, and I'm from what I guess you could call the FODA for the day, and I'm going to give our analysis of the Belsomra data. So the two things I'm going to cover, mainly I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the safety concerns that we found with this, even though Merck didn't mention a lot of those. And then I'm also going to briefly go over some of the objectives, efficacy results. So our key safety concerns that we had was daytime somnolence, so that means daytime drowsiness, which can be severe and occurs suddenly in some of these patients. And the problem with that, safety-wise, is that patients drive while impaired, okay? And also, on top of this, there's unconscious nighttime activity, there's suicidal ideation, so considering suicide, and then there's some other things I'm not going to go into as much detail about, but there are other narcolepsy-associated events, such as sleep paralysis, so feeling paralyzed while you're sleeping, hypnagogic hallucinations, which is when you start to hallucinate as you fall asleep, and also some mild cataplexy was seen too. This is where when you're laughing or smiling, suddenly you get really weak in the legs and you can actually collapse. So that was seen in a few patients as well. So I'm not going to go into details about that, but just know that those were seen as well as safety issues. Okay, so the first one, and one of the ones that we're really concerned with, is the daytime somnolence. Like I said, this is daytime drowsiness. So even though the Belsomra increases the sleep time, what happens is a lot of these patients reported being more sleepy during the day. In fact, some were even much more sleepier. And the thing is that it was dose related. So we believe this is a direct effect of the drug. So as you can see here in this table, for the somnolence, so the drowsiness in the placebo, there's about 3%, and that increases all the way up to about 11% of patients in the high dose group. Okay, and so these are substantial numbers as well in these studies. And then the more extreme version, the excessive daytime sleepiness, which was defined by the sponsor as beyond potential residual drug effect. Persistent, recurrent impairing may be sudden and involuntary. Okay, so this could cause some serious issues during the day. That, again, dose-dependent response. So we believe this is a direct response from this drug, from 0.2% in the placebo all the way up to 1.1% in the high dose. So this is very concerning to us. And the reason why this is very concerning to us is because patients have to drive, and when you're excessively sleepy, this can be an issue. The patients were unable to avoid driving in the studies while seemingly impaired by excessive daytime sleepiness, despite close clinical monitoring and warnings. So for example, some of the things that they were warned about, it says it may make you sleepy. It says your ability to drive or operate other heavy machinery may be impaired after taking the study drug, and yet these patients still drove. So if these warnings weren't effective in the study, how are they going to be used once it's outside of the study by everyday people? People have to drive. And so there's an increased FDA understanding that patients are not reliably aware of drug impairment. You know, they may feel fine to drive, but that doesn't mean they are. And even if they are aware, sometimes you just have to drive. You know, you can't halt your life because you happened to take this drug last night so you could fall asleep a little sooner. So some of the findings, some of the results, they did 2 small driving studies. So again, take this with a grain of salt because these were smaller studies, okay? 24 patients in the adult group and 28 here. However, even with these small numbers, for the 2 doses, the lower and higher dose on the first night, it was statistically significant impairment in both groups for the adults less than 65. And then after 1 week, there was still statistically significant difference for the high dose group. In the elderly, it wasn't quite significant, but it's starting to lean towards it. And normally we don't put a lot of importance on leaning towards significance, especially when it comes to efficacy, but we are more cautious when it comes to safety. And specifically, since this was such a small study, leaning towards significance with such few numbers is kind of concerning. So in addition to that, there's also unconscious nighttime behavior. And so this is just a case report of one incident that happened. So it was a 65-year-old man. So he was being studied, this sleep study. So they were tracking him as he slept. So during this, after he was dosed, he was talking in his sleep, sat up in bed, and went back to sleep. However, then after that, he lunged out of bed and hit his head and face against a wall. Okay, and even after that, 2 weeks after, he was sleepwalking, which he never had in the past, an issue of sleepwalking. He slept, talked, but didn't walk. And so it's concerning to see this type of event in relatively small numbers of patients. And the catch too with this was reported because this was done in the sleep study. You know, that most of the results from this weren't being studied as they slept. So this is a small subsample of what was actually going on. How many people were doing this every night and didn't realize it because they're asleep and they don't remember it, or whoever's sleeping next to them, isn't remembering it. So the fact that they were able to see this in this small sample indicates that it could be a much larger problem that is just not being caught. Also, there's suicidal ideation, and so it was, again, a dose response, an increase from placebo, and only 1 patient again in the low dose, however up to 9 patients, so it goes up to 0.7% in the high dose. It was generally considered mild, but still thought to indicate increased risk of suicide. Patients had a prior history and or ongoing psychosocial stress, and it's still consistent with drug-related adverse effect in patients with baseline risk factors. So another thing too is you have to think that some people who have these underlying conditions, mental conditions, might also have insomnia as well. So the people who are going to be taking this might actually be, might have more of a tendency to have problems and increased risk for this when it goes out into the general public compared to just, everyone else. All right. So that was their safety issues, and then just briefly efficacy. So subjective sleep time, which is what the company emphasized a lot, is known, and it shows it looks like Belsomra works. However, it's less effective because the problem is that when you ask people how well you slept last night, what they say, and it sounds positive, I slept really well last night, actually might be a problem with the drug, because if these people are sitting up at night and doing things they don't realize, just because they're not remembering that the next day and as a side effect of the drug, it's considered a positive, because when you ask them, they say, oh yeah, I slept great. But in reality, they're doing, who knows what at night. And so it's actually a bad side effect of the drug that's being interpreted as something positive. So instead of focusing on the subjective aspects of it, we looked at the objective, so the actual measured time differences between falling asleep and staying asleep. So this data, this slide is kind of busy. Let me just try and break it down for you quickly. So we looked at the 2 different age groups. Less than 65 is blue, greater than 65 in age is red, okay? And we looked at 3 different time points. Day 1, day 28, day 90. And the important things here to see are that the placebo groups here, okay, this is the, this is the sleep maintenance, the amount of time you stayed asleep, and this is in minutes over here. And so you see that the placebo is higher up for all of these, okay? So yes, taking this drug did decrease the amount of time that they were awake at night. We agree with this. However, an important thing to notice here is that for all the doses, it looks about the same. You don't see a huge difference between the low dose and the high dose, which Merck had mentioned that they didn't even look. This is actually representative of 10 milligrams. So this is what Merck had mentioned was not an acceptable amount, because they said that they didn't really see an effect. But what we saw was that, yes, there was an effect when you look at the objective data. This is a sleep onset, so how long it takes you to fall asleep, okay? Again, some striking things here. There's not a huge difference between placebo and the treatment groups for any of these. This one you would say yes on day 1. However, once you get out to day 90, there's not a huge difference between the placebo and these. It's been changed from milligrams, so it's not the dosing, but basically keep in mind that this first one is about equivalent to taking the 10 milligrams, okay? So that's the lowest dose, which the company said was not effective in patients. However, we see that with the 10 milligrams, it looks just as effective as when you give them the highest dose when you look at this measure of time. So this is the amount of time it takes to fall asleep. So keep this in mind, because when you look over here at the x-axis, so this is in minutes. So this is a change from baseline. So 0 is baseline. So an interesting thing to me is that the placebo actually reduced the amount of time it took to fall asleep, okay? So then you have to look at the difference between placebo and the drug, which actually is not that much. And we'd say about like 6 minutes difference, okay? And like I said, that's on top of what the placebo is already helping them fall asleep. So some conclusions, we have major safety concerns with this drug. Daytime somnolence, impaired driving, unconscious nighttime behaviors, suicidal ideation, and narcolepsy-like symptoms. And then, once again, we've seen potentially serious adverse effects and is clearly dose-related for all of these effects. The patients can't reliably respond to their own risk from the drug. We've seen this in this study, and again, if you extrapolate this to the general public, we have to imagine that people would be even less aware because they're not in a controlled clinical study while they're taking this drug. There's no clear efficacy decrease down to and including 10 milligrams. So again, we question why the company didn't study 10 milligrams and why they might not recommend that dosage for people to try. The risk-benefit balance might be even better if less than the maximum efficacy at doses lower than 10 milligrams. And there's no apparent justification for using higher doses of an insomnia drug than necessary for efficacy, because that could just increase the risk for the safety effects. So, thank you. Questions?
So our friend from Merck said that they excluded a number of people from the study. Are you okay with the exclusion criteria?
The FDA was in communication with the company, and we okayed their study design, so I'm assuming yes. Yeah.
Do you know how this compares in terms of both safety and efficacy with other sleep aids that are already on the market?
I know other ones have had issues as well, specifically related to dosage, Ambien, that we talked about. So the FDA, we keep this in mind as we're looking at this for insomnia drugs and the side effects that we've seen with other ones, but we didn't do a direct comparison with safety for this drug compared to other ones that are currently on the market.
Was there any information that you saw on a rebound effect? Apparently this drug is to be taken forever. But since it's affected the first night, theoretically you could take it sporadically. But is there a rebound effect, and do I need to define rebound effect?
Yeah, could you define the rebound effect? Sorry.
After using a drug for a short period of time, not using it creates a stronger response, a stronger symptom than you started with. Typical with sleeping drugs, heartburn, AIDS, it comes back harder, worse.
Mm-hmm. So after you stop using it, then when you start back, it comes back quicker, you'd say? No.
After you stop using it, you can't sleep worse. Your insomnia comes back
I
more
see.
worse.
Mm-hmm.
I apologize.
Yeah,
for
no,
my lack of
that's
English.
fine.
And therefore driving you to use the drug again.
Mm-hmm. So I guess in these controlled studies, we didn't see that because, again, they were taking the drug the entire time, and I'm not sure if they followed them after they had stopped or if they just followed them to the point of the last day of taking the drug.
I have a quick question. You mentioned one patient who hit his head against the wall or something. It wasn't clear, was that intentional or did the person fall?
He was not aware that he did that.
Well, I mean intentional in the sense that while sleeping, he intended it. subconsciously intended it as opposed to falling or something. That I'm just trying to figure out if this was like a violent act versus a accident.
So they didn't define it in their description, again, because we got this from the company, so this is the company's description that we had to pull out. But I envisioned it as as with like nighttime walking, like just sitting up unconsciously and hitting your head. So I don't think it was meant to be violent. I think you're just unconscious. You don't know what you're doing when you're moving. And so he slammed his head in the wall because he wasn't awake when he did it.
Okay, so the drug maker says this is uniquely metabolized. It's a brand new way of eliciting sleep. I'm curious as to where in the body it's metabolized. Is it in the liver? And whether there's potential for interaction with alcohol.
That is a good question, and that was not studied as far as I know, the interactions, because again, a lot of times too, people who have insomnia are known to self-medicate with other things, and be it other drugs or alcohol, and so that would be a really good thing for them to study as well, but I'm not sure if they actually conducted that in this.
I received financial support from the company, the manufacturer of Belsomra, for my travel expenses to come here, as well as the hotel room. Plus, they gave me 3 months of the medicine for free, but I do not consider this to be a conflict of interest. I am speaking from my perspective as a patient in the clinical trials. I was having tremendous difficulty sleeping until I took Belsomra. I think this product should be approved because with it I was able to get to sleep quicker, at least 5 minutes, and I was able to sleep much longer, at least 20 minutes. In fact, it even made me so sleepy that the next day when I was driving the car, I fell asleep too, and I even fell asleep at work. I mean, I thought it was wonderful. So I once again ask the FDA to please approve this drug. Thank you.
Good morning, panel. I'm Dr. Paul R. Brown, president of the American Dream Association, the ADA. We're a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that Americans get enough sleep. We do this through education, public awareness, and advocacy. Our organization is 25 years old and is the leading nonprofit representing improved sleep for the general public. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about this new drug submitted by Merck. We need new drugs to improve the quality of life for millions of Americans suffering from sleep disorders. Before continuing, I should note that in addition to heading the American Dream Association, I work as a sleep specialist and have done research for Merck. Also, our nonprofit, the ADA, is supported by contributions from a variety of sources, including individuals, government grants, foundations, corporations. In addition, the American Dream Association has received grants from pharmaceutical companies. However, that represents a minuscule amount of our revenues. ADA believes in the health benefits of a good night's sleep. Lack of sleep negatively affects our daily lives. It impairs our thinking, the quality of our work, and how we interact with other people. People who get up on the wrong side of the bed probably didn't get 8 hours of sleep. Getting the sleep we need to function at our best is not easy. As a bleary-eyed doctor, I can tell you that some people have trouble falling asleep, some have difficulty staying asleep, and some experience fitful sleeping, and on a bad night, they experience all three. With some folks, these problems are short-term, but for others, it's long-term. Insomnia is the most common sleep complaint, much more common than other sleep disorders. Research polls that our organization has done show that more than half of Americans report having symptoms of insomnia at one night a week or sometimes more. Insomnia affects millions of Americans and their families, and they are seeking relief from this tiring affliction. Our country has been working on this issue for decades. Back in 1979, the Institute of Medicine issued a report on insomnia, followed by the creation of Project Sleep, which looked at improved options for treatment. Today, perhaps relatedly, we're here to consider a new treatment option. It's been a long time since a new sleeping aid has been approved in the US. Doctors and patients need more options for safe and effective treatment for a condition that affects tens of millions of Americans. The American Dream Association welcomes innovation. The American Dream Association wants a better solution to insomnia. We want to empower patients to ask for and receive more choices for treating insomnia. We are encouraged that a new treatment for insomnia is being discussed today, a new treatment that may bring relief to millions of Americans who desperately need sleep. We urge the panel to approve this new drug.
Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Leon. I do not have any financial disclosures or personal ties to the company. And I'm speaking from my perspective as a patient. I come from a long line of insomniacs, and members of my family have always suffered from chronic fatigue and chronic pain. I am also a middle school bus driver for my career. And functioning in the morning is not only a matter of public safety, it's a matter of personal safety. And on any given day, I would like to kill myself because I am a middle school bus driver. So the fact this product is not only not improving my sleep during the trial, but making me a worse middle school bus driver is borderline criminal. And I can't strongly enough state how I would like the FDA to not approve this drug and see that it never comes on the market. Some of the things that disturbed me about the testimony today from the drug company was the rushing through the information and constantly glossing over key facts. We kept hearing about subjective data. We kept hearing about leaning towards significance. What does that mean? I'm a bus driver, but I know that that does not mean that it's significant. It's leaning toward it. A small minority of a sample was mentioned. I would like to suggest that the hallucinations are a very, very real and important side effect. So not only would the sleep not be restorative and effective, it could be dangerous during the night and on the job. Also to note that just because a drug puts you to sleep fast, that doesn't mean it's getting you that restorative sleep that you need. You're just basically drugged and you pass out. So again, I would like to state that because there are no long-term studies, there's no sex-specific dosing and outcomes information for this drug, I would encourage the FDA to please deny this drug. Thank you.
My name is Drew West, and I have been using Balsama for quite a while now. I have tried many, many other prescription drugs, and this one has been the most effective for me. I feel like I get the most sleep, and I feel that it has really helped me. So I am hoping that this drug will be approved and available to the public. Oh, I have no financial conflicts. I came here on my own dime. Yeah.
Excuse me, no rude questions, please. We're going to start our discussion, our panel discussion, and then we're going to vote. So, who would like to make any comments or ask any other questions of Merck or of the FDA?
Oh, thank you. Hello, I'm the industry rep. I haven't spoken at this point, but I'm really interested in hearing from the sponsor about the need for this drug and the need for the new pathway for this drug, if they could fill us in on that again. That was very interesting. Thank you.
So you're referring to a new mechanism of action on this drug? Yes. So we feel like this new mechanism of action is important because it targets it blocks the wake chemical, the wake signaling pathway in the brain, and that's something that none of the other sleep medicines have done. And so since this represents a new way of acting, we feel like it represents a lot of potential for patients who perhaps have failed other sleep medications.
Question. Given the fact that it is a new mechanism, in your longer-term safety, studies, did you look at comparing, or why did you think, if you were comparing it to the existing drugs that are on the market that were using a different mechanism?
Right. Well, so as you know, for FDA approval, we don't do comparative effectiveness, and so we just compared it to placebo, and found that it was very effective in improving sleep onset and sleep maintenance.
A question maybe you already mentioned, maybe I forgot. How many elderly in the elderly group? What is the sample numbers?
So they were, I believe, the slides 46% elderly, and that was of the phase 3 sample, and there were something like 2,800 patients in that sample. So I guess probably 1,200 or something were elderly, and that's classified as age 65 or greater.
Yeah. Okay.
Elderly, and I understand the percent you just stated, but could you break down elderly into 10-year increments? How many in the 60 to 75, 75 to 85, et cetera?
We'll get that slide for you after lunch as well.
I'm interested in learning from the sponsor about the investment in this clinical trial that included the number of countries and several thousand patients that was made by Merck to make sure that we have the information that's necessary, and also the kind of research that was done to find out what kinds of patients there must be a real need for new kinds of sleep aids. So I'd be interested in knowing what Merck has done so that we can appreciate it. Thank you.
So you're asking about the investment in terms of dollars?
And time.
And
yes.
time.
And commitment.
Okay. Well, that's
Needs.
proprietary information, so we can't share that today. But we have surveyed patients and found that they basically feel like there are a lot of sleep pills that just are not effective, and so we based our need. We identified the need based on what we found talking to patients, and of course, sleep doctors will tell us too. They struggle all the time with patients who just can't fall asleep at night, and they need new treatments. And so we felt like we have a huge percentage of the population who could benefit from this drug.
Thank you.
Along those lines, you're talking about subjective assessment of the benefits of the drug, and I believe I noticed that in one of your confirmatory hearings there was a huge discrepancy between the subjective and the objective data, with the objective data showing very little benefit. Could you address that, please?
Well, and that's a very good question, because we feel like the subjective data are very important, because we actually find that the most of the sleep medications on the market actually have similar numbers when it comes to the objective efficacy, and so that means that most of them really just improve and help people fall asleep a little bit faster and make them stay asleep just a few minutes longer. But patients in their subjective reports actually report a much better sleep experience, and so we feel like it's very important to take into account patients' experience with their sleep, because we do find that they seem to really find a big effect from these drugs.
I'm trying to understand why you chose the doses that you did to market. 10 appears to be saturating the pathway that you're targeting, and higher doses do no more than saturate it. Whereas as you raise the doses, the side effects that are serious become more numerous. Why did you choose 20 and 40 to market instead of 10?
Well, like I mentioned, in our phase 2 trials, we found very sporadic effectiveness of the 10 milligram dose, and so it just didn't always seem to be that effective. And when we looked at the 20 milligram dose, we found much better effectiveness. And as with most drugs, it's always a toss-up with side effects versus benefit. And so we felt like with the 20 milligram dose that profile was still beneficial.
I have a question of the sponsor and also of the FDA. I'm a little confused because it seems to me that people take sleeping pills so that they'll have more energy the next day. Not that we necessarily want to sleep for 8 hours, but we want to feel like we've slept for 8 hours. So I'm wondering, so I'll ask the sponsor what measures you took in terms of how, whether patients, participants took, had to have a lot of caffeine the next day or took uppers. You know, is this an Elvis Presley situation of going from uppers to downers? What data do you have on that?
So that wasn't something that we typically track in studies of sleep medications. We rely on the subjective measures of patients' reported sleep, and those are the outcome measures that FDA and industry have collaborated with for many years now. And indeed, many of the previous drugs that have been approved have used those same endpoints. And so we feel like they are good measures of the effectiveness of our drug. And I'll let the FDA comment now as well.
Okay, and of the FDA, I guess I would follow that up with, you have clearly concerns about sleepiness the next day, and that's part of what I was asking, but I wonder if there's a reason why the FDA hasn't asked about some of these other kind of outcome measures, such as the need for more caffeine or other drugs to help people wake up.
I kind of touched on this earlier as well. I think it needs to be revisited, the outcomes that are measured for insomnia drugs. I think we as the FDA need to revisit our recommendations on this as well, since they were, again, haven't been updated since 1974. And so that touches on this, like instead of looking at the sleep time, look at the next day, the quality of life the next day, because really that's what we feel like might be important to patients, not just that you're sleeping, asleep 5 minutes faster, 6 minutes faster, whatever. So that's something that needs to be addressed, not only by us, but also just the sleep industry as a whole.
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around the patient testimonies and what I saw presented by the FDA. And in my own practice, I see lots of patients being benefited by this drug. So I just wondered if there were any plans for any follow-up studies to look at a larger group to see whether or not these side effects are rare or if they are in the whole population.
Well, we feel like our year-long study was a good measure of the long-term side effects of our drug, and feel like we've convincingly established our safety and effectiveness. And so unless FDA tells us otherwise, we feel that we have done a good job establishing our drug's benefit.
Could you tell me what is the half-life time of this drug?
So the half-life is 12 hours, and it will reach steady state after 3 days.
Okay.
So you'll be fast asleep after 3 days.
So to me, this drug has a relatively long impact on people. Taking this drug even after taking sleep, but the next day when you're driving, it could impact the safety, and that is a concern to me about.
Right, I understand, but our numbers, as you recall, we did not have much problem with accidents. In fact, we did not have any accidents reported. We had some next day somnolence reported, but we did not see any issues with driving accidents. We did have some people who had problems with the driving study, but there were just a few. And as with any drug, you're always going to have people who don't tolerate it as well, but the vast majority of patients did really well on it.
Yeah, no, I thought it was more important that we discuss, especially those of you who've never been to advisory committee, discuss the format, which, very abbreviated and somewhat different, and lots more discussion and lots more questions, but certain things were rather typical too. So I'm going to open that up to those of you who've been to advisory committees. Would you like to talk about how this seemed different?
For answering with information on the studies and the rest of that, there was no, we'll get back to you after lunch. These people were really good at what they did, and they had the answer virtually instantaneously. A few times they had to wait a couple of minutes to get to it. But the morning, which was all of the presentations by the FDA and by them, was probably 80% sponsor, 20% FDA overall in that balance. And you had red lights, of course, when you're doing your presentations. So as a patient, a consumer representative there, not representative, as somebody testifying as a patient, you had 3 minutes and that was all you had. And they cut off the mic on you at that point.
This was the same FDA hearing that he attended as well, but what I noticed, and there was a little bit more, I think, dialogue here. There's a lot more dialogue, actually. But there wasn't any ability to refute the data. So it was kind of people's own interpretation or knowledge base on the panel of what they understood behind the data. The graphics for the pharmaceutical companies were better, for example, and it's a small thing, but it influences. The emotional testimonies that were given carried some weight because you could see the faces on the panel as they heard some of this information, but it was all about the data. The decision really at the end of the day came down to whatever, you know, in this particular case there were some conflicts of interest, but came down to which organization presented their data better and could then make their case stronger. So there wasn't any opportunity like we have here to break apart the data, to challenge certain assertions, and to see the distinctions between the two. So that's my observation.
I remember at the Assure meeting, one of the panel members did ask, and the FDA official had the company answer the question. That was actually intended for the patients, and then that was followed by several other questions that the patients would have been very able to answer, I remember, at the Assure meeting. But instead it was asked of the company that couldn't answer them, and in some cases the FDA that couldn't answer them.
Just a minor sort of subjective observation in the two FDA meetings I participated in. One was on the REMS, the training, physician training, and the other was on a specific opioid. There was an absolutely palpable sense that the decision was already pre-wired, given the history of the analgesic and addiction products division's involvement in approval of over 30 opioid drugs, and the advisory committee actually had a history of overriding recommendations against. So despite some very compelling public comment, there were 5 minutes provided, not 3, which was a somewhat hopeful sign. The United States Senator came in on his own time to participate. There were a number of very compelling physicians and experienced persons participating, but it still had this, I just sort of had a dreaded feeling the entire day because it just seemed predetermined.
I did want to ask, I thought Paul Brown Dr. Brown, of course, did a great job also of a very typical medical association testimony. If you listen carefully, he never once said anything specific about the drug. This is very, very typical. They're just in favor of everything, and they're in favor of choices, and they have no particular interest in the data. They often do have conflicts of interest because their medical association gets money from the company. I wanted to open up, we only have a few more minutes. I wanted to ask the question of everybody in the room, do you feel that the votes might have been influenced by having more public comment speakers giving personal stories, maybe one's a little less extreme. I mean, we did like the humor, but a little less extreme. And oops, and they're up. My mic's dead. All right. This one. Try this one. And having more personal stories that seemed maybe a little bit more believable? Do you think that would have at least potentially made a difference? Because the patients talking about the risks were way outnumbered by the patients saying, thank God for this drug, and also for the most part claiming that they did not have financial ties, although we know from experience that a lot of times patients say, I have no financial conflicts of interest, or they might even say, nobody's paid me to come here, but then they don't say, but after I testify, my hotel room will be paid for, some other thing. Or even that they wouldn't have heard about it if it wasn't for the company reaching out to them or the doctor working for the company reaching out to them.
And I can speak to my experience at what do you call the cystic fibrosis testimony, patient testimony. Prior to our meeting, we have several members, although we're not supposed to do it, but we discussed a little bit, very worrisome about that particular trial. And one member even said, I'm not going to vote for it. It's just too sloppy. It's just not a good trial. But when we start having patients coming to do the testimony, they're crying tears, children, small children with a father. Emotional expression or testimony really play a role in that particular testimony. And I even felt, I voted no, but it was a hard decision. And I felt like, what I do with the patient, where they later send me black email. But I really felt the other side well organized to bring their patients in. And their letter is all same format by the foundation. So you can see they're well organized. So then later, several members changed their vote. I think a lot is based on emotional vote. So I think it does work when you really bring in a lot of patients and play the emotional role, whether on both sides, and it does work sometimes.
But I think by the time you get to that point, it's a predetermined decision. So it would almost have to be extremely compelling, and you have to bring in multiple people to really articulate their stories in a very succinct way to affect that kind of change at the final hearing. It's like congressional testimony. Everything's pre-scripted. So if you had a series of hearings where you brought in people and you could have a equal side conversation, maybe better decisions would be made. I don't know if they do that on a regular basis. I know it's time intensive. I know it's money intensive. I get all that, but it's important. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I would also just say that the Yaz hearing that you went to was a little unusual in that it had so many panel members with conflicts of interest, undisclosed conflicts of interest, so that you're right that there was a certain amount of predetermination of how certain people were going to vote. I do think the testimony that families made, such as your family, was effective for some votes, just not enough, and I think partly because of those conflicts, and also, the company was really strong. I mean, they got the best experts money could buy, and that's not unusual, but at that meeting it was more so than usual, a little more extreme.
And so some would have voted differently. They really wanted the drug off the market. If the question had been asked differently, they would have voted in the way we wanted them to. And then Rick and I went to one where they were voting whether Yaz should be given to teenagers. Well, they voted on the question before they heard from the public. So by the time we spoke, the question wasn't even open yet, still. So.
What made that sort of less effective than the Eshur testimony? And I mean, we just heard some answers to that, but is there anything that we could do to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the Essure testimony had numbers. They had huge numbers, and they had very few people in public comment testifying in favor. I mean, they had a few, but the women were very, very strong. And despite, you know, the slideshow issues and the really demoralizing setup of the room and things like that, you know, I thought the women were well prepared because they had been working together for so many years.